Kenny Goodman here from findtheedge.com. If you're an entrepreneur or a business leader, I'm sure you're starting to understand that knowledge is key. Information is key. And if you've got a business or a big organization and you're not managing that knowledge properly, all sorts of things can get lost. So today I'm really excited because we've got Paul Corney with us, who is going to explain all about knowledge management. And Paul is an expert on how you can use stories to both retain this knowledge and also help get strategies across and bring people together. So good morning to you, Paul. How are you?
Good morning, Kenny. I'm feeling pretty good. The sun's shining.
Yes, it is here in Manchester as well, which is a nice surprise, especially this time of year as well. So how would you describe what you do and where did it all start?
Okay, let's yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. Let me do the starting, because probably that's useful in terms of the describing what I do as a result. I was very lucky. I started in the banking industry at a time when the country I spent most of my life working in and around was Saudi Arabia, and back in the late 70s it was developing as a country, and before it became the powerhouse that it is today. And what was particularly interesting, just looking back, was the sort of issues that they had were around raising debt, raising equity. And at the time I was working in the corporate finance division, so we were helping to place debt and equity, but we had to know a lot about what clients did and how they worked and what they were interested in. And over the 20 years or so I worked there, it was customer relationships were key. You don't go to people in the Middle East and just turn up and say, this is what I've got, and walk away. It's a different culture. You have to deal around the person as well as the transaction. Anyway, what I found happened was gradually it became clear to me that it was the way you used knowledge and information that set you apart from other people who were just transactional salesmen, if you like.
Yep.
And that accelerated when, back in the mid-90s, the building I was in got blown up, and a lot of the confidential papers disappeared off down the high street. That may sound quite dramatic, but actually it was a wake-up call. And what we tried to do at the time was to create a one-screen view of all client activity, what we knew about the client, what they'd done, who they'd spoken to, and that sort of thing. So back in 93, 94, that was the forerunner of what you or I today would describe as an intranet.
Yeah.
And really that was my genesis into the whole sort of knowledge and information management arena, because it was about how could you provide information and insight to make better decisions.
Yeah.
And it was, it's not just fluffy bunny stuff. There is a real thing about being better at knowing where to go to find things, who to go to find things, and being able to draw on past experience. And I'll give you one anecdote in a very simple way. I was in the office of one of the treasurer of the National Oil Company. I was his advisor as part of what we were doing for the organisation. And what was particularly funny was he said to me, "Would you wait outside? Would you wait here, because I've got some people I want you to meet." He ushered 4 people in from different, all besuited, who'd obviously flown from different parts of the world, and they were from the same organisation. And he said to them, "Gentlemen, you may not know each other, but you're all working in the same organisation. I'm happy to talk to you, but can you please coordinate who is going to be your spokesperson?"
Right, okay. It's all about knowledge management, so it's about managing the knowledge. So does this encompass, obviously you just mentioned clients as well, what else does this knowledge entail?
It's about clients, but it's about markets, it's about the people themselves, and it's about your past experiences. One of the biggest challenges organizations are facing today is when people with long-standing experience depart.
Yeah.
how do you grab hold of that, and not in an unpleasant way, but how do you actually make use of what they know? Some of it may not be, but when people leave, they don't just go, their networks go. And I think one of the stories that I always fall back on, when we're doing a piece of work on the evolving role of the knowledge manager, and one of the pieces of work that was particularly interesting to me was talking to a former chief knowledge officer of a global food company, who said one of the things they were finding it increasingly difficult when they were doing new products to go to people who knew something about it. So he actually did a poll around the world in his organization and said, who knows anything about this subject? Who would you go to? And of the 50 names that came up, 35 of them were no longer part of the organization. So what had happened was they'd gone, and their ability to contact them and ask questions had also gone.
Yep.
Hence the problem. So that's one definition. I think in terms of definition, everybody always loves definition. I always like that. If you like the strap line, the World Bank came up with when they were developing their knowledge strategy, which was provides insight for decision making.
Yeah, yeah. So what processes would you undertake if you're a business leader and you think, you know what, this guy Paul Corney here, he's making quite a bit of sense, and I've got quite a lot of employees, some very key employees, key management, the rest of it, and they hold a lot of knowledge, but I've not really got this knowledge anywhere safe. What do I do to make sure that this knowledge is safe and it's easy to draw upon and easy to manage?
The word safe is an interesting one, because I don't think any knowledge is ever safe. Because it's about context. It's about what the person, the place, and the time. The one thing that every organisation has to do is to decide what I would call their critical knowledge assets. What are the critical knowledge assets that drive the business? Let me give you a couple of examples. If you look on the one hand for, say, the nuclear industry, one of the biggest issues for them is, how do you prevent? It's all about process. What knowledge can you build into the process to ensure that what you know before has really been taken forward to how you sort of develop future products, if you like, or even future processes. So there's techniques that you can introduce to make sure that you learn from what you've done before. But the biggest thing for me is to go through a process of saying, okay, this is what you want to be as an organisation. This is the strategy that you have. Now, lots of organisations have striven to be what they call knowledge-enabled organisations and knowledge-driven organisations, where knowledge is actually at the core of what they do. And I always think, I did some work in the city for a number of years with an organisation in the reinsurance industry. They were reinsurance brokers. And for them, as a classic arbitrager, it's actually using their knowledge of what's in one market and applying it to their knowledge of a client and placing the risk in the best place. So for them, it was actually having to have a knowledge of markets, a knowledge of clients, and a knowledge actually of what was likely to happen, a future knowledge, if you like, an assessment of what they thought might happen in the climate. So what disasters were likely to occur. So in a nutshell, it's the ability to pull together for each business, what are the critical knowledge assets that you as a business have, and how can you make sure that they are, if you like, shared in the best possible way. And that might not be putting them down in a database, which it probably won't be. It might be actually encouraging dialogue. It might be through the use of narrative and stories, where you use a story to illustrate something that has happened.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I've looked at what you do, and a lot of the stuff that you do is based around stories. And we all know that stories are important. I do. I'm in marketing, so I understand that. If you can get a message across with a story, then people are much more likely to engage with it, because it develops all sorts of reference points for them. A story can be very emotive as well. So if you go into a business and you're chatting to the business leaders, and they're saying, listen, first of all, we want to start collating all the knowledge that is already within the company. We want to go through a process where we start collating that knowledge. Secondly, we want processes put in place so that going forwards, knowledge is collected or spread, or whatever way you want to do it going forward. And also, how do we get all the stories out of the organisation, and how do we make sure that they live on throughout the organisation?
Whew, long question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's just think that the value of stories for me are in collaboration, are in communications, and that's both internal and external, as you alluded to, and for engagement, and that might be with the strategy. It might be to actually roll the strategy out, or to set a strategy up, and probably also to do with engaging people in the organisation itself with what's happened, and as a way of sharing experiences that have happened. I've got numerous examples. Let me take you back to the genesis of my immersion, if you like, in this idea of using narrative and story as a way of just capturing experience and expanding insight. I did a piece of, I participated years ago, back in the early 2000s, in a knowledge management fair that took place in Brussels. And it was it was in Amsterdam. And it was interesting for a couple of reasons, because what happened was, my colleagues and I at the time were there from, in the middle of a big technology fair, and we were actually ringing a bell and encouraging people to come and talk to us and use an object to share a story about the time when they'd illustrated how they felt at work. Now, one of the attendees was a gentleman from the Swiss government who was part of the foreign aid projects, and he had a way of, he thought storytelling had real legs in his arena, because it'd be a very different way of trying to capture the experiences and to, if you like, note the difference between what a project had done for people and versus the dry statistical information that normally comes, where you say we've spent 27 million and we've created 200 miles of road or something, for example.
Yeah.
So that was and we embarked with them for, I guess, about 3 or 4 years, using storytelling as a way of bringing a lot of experiences to life. Another following piece of work was around in the Middle East this time, where the organisation was trying to assess the impact of donations that it had made through a charitable fund, and it wanted again to bring to life the impact that it had on real people.
Yep.
That was a huge illustration where they ran a storytelling competition. Another organisation wanted to engage with its staff. It had been in operation for 40 years, and what was it looking to do? It was looking to bring out some of the experiences that others could have learned, to draw on the alumni who'd actually left as well, to bring them back into the organisation, and most importantly, I think, is to make young people, when they arrive, feel part of an organisation. So in that situation, not only did my colleagues and I from Spark at the time create what would be called a coffee table book, which looked at the events of the bank over a 40-year time sweep through the lenses of people who'd actually been involved, but it also was a soundscape of how the bank actually sounded at work. What was it like? So that if somebody walking down a sort of a marbled floor with an atrium, and that you hear the tea trolley, just the sounds in the background helped situated the people when they were going to work there.
Oh, so you created a CD for this?
We created a CD in addition, which is quite a revolutionary way of going about it. So, and the other thing that we did, Kenny, was that we created a set of clips, sound clips, that were used for provocation pieces, to stimulate discussion and debate. And actually, let's go back. in a little bit. We were talking earlier on about what knowledge management is about. It's about dialogue. You know, we learn best when we communicate with each other and we exchange ideas.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you have to have ways of provocating and encouraging that discussion. So there were about 30 clips that we used to bring to life the experiences of the organisation. So one I always remember, one of the clips was called White Knight, which was the managing director general describing his first day or first week in the office, right, and what it felt like and how different it was, and he then as part of the same interview, he brought to life what development banking was, which was hugely important for people who were entering the fray.
Yeah, if you'd just joined that business, or even if you'd been in that business for a long time, wild horses wouldn't keep you away from listening to that, would it? You'd be so intrigued as to what the content would be.
Well, I can remember we created something for. We created a website for the Islamic Development Bank. And at the annual meeting of the Islamic Development Bank, the governor's meeting in Kuala Lumpur, I was there to give a presentation to the board and the governors on what had happened, how this project had gone around. It was about creating a set of oral histories for the founding fathers of the bank. But what was fascinating was I can remember sitting there with a couple of finance ministers at the little booth that we'd set up, with both of them having their headphones on, listening to the president describe some of his early experiences of working in being a founding father of what was Islamic banking at the time, setting up Islamic banking. And driving 4 or 5 hours across a desert in the case of the vice president, to hear that.
Yeah, so this kind of stuff, this content that you're helping to create there, it can be used for many things. It can be used for training, it can be used for induction. Could it be used for customers as well?
Well, very much so, because you can hear very often it's about bringing the insight of the organisation. Here's a great example. It's one of the very good clips that on knowledge management, and the impact that it can have is from Rio Tinto Zinc, who spent a fair bit of time and effort creating what's called a community of practice, which is a global knowledge network around their business heads. So, for example, they use these huge, gigantic diggers to move earth around. And I can't remember the precise incident, but I know there was an issue with one of the pieces of equipment. And as part of this network they had, and they posted a question, and somebody in a totally different part of the organisation, in a different location, was able to respond and say, "Yep, you know what? We've just picked that up." And anyway, they actually produced a video that tells the story, and they were able to quantify significantly the savings, because they said, this makes a difference. As a slightly lighter thing, I'm going to Khartoum this weekend to help the health industry in Sudan to think more about how it might use knowledge, and basically starting with how it gathers information, as a way of helping that to make better decisions and get better patient outcomes. Now, one simple example, and it might be quite trite, but there was a wonderful episode on a program called Grey's Anatomy in the US, where they were showing a surgeon performing an operation, and alongside it, one of the interns was actually tweeting.
Right.
And the surgeon berated the intern, said, "Put that away, you're not texting in here." And the intern said, "I'm not texting, I'm tweeting." So there was a great debate. Anyway, and fast forward after 9 minutes. Again, this clip is online on YouTube. But fast forward, and you find there is a wonderful example of the surgeon actually being given some advice while he's in the operating theatre by a former colleague of his in another part of the world.
Amazing.
So in a way, that's what I'm trying to bring, and that's where I think this whole idea of knowledge management has most legs. It's the ability to you know, again, a surgeon is embarking upon obviously he's making a decision when he's doing an operation.
Yep. Yep.
So it's how do you bring better information and knowledge, because knowledge is about, okay, what do we do in that situation? Are the parameters the same? And the whole thing has to be about capturing it. One of the best examples of it, in my view, is the Olympic movement. If you think about it, the Olympic movement, every year it passes on to the next host city how it best to transfer the knowledge that it had gained over the 4 years when it was building it.
How do they do this?
That is a much longer conversation. There are something like 39 different organised steps that are taken, different parts. It's about videoing, it's about shadowing, and all these things are knowledge management techniques. It's about putting people alongside. The Russians, for example, would have had about 5,000 people at the various parts of London 2012 following what was going on, but they would have been involved in the meetings beforehand. Right. You know, and there's such little things like, how do you get the right approved contractors list? Yeah. How do you perform an after action review once something's happened?
Yeah.
How do you bring the best people to bear? You know, the whole thing about running, it's a massive project management organisation, and if you think about it, it's exactly the same as any business would be involved in.
Yep. So it involves really hard figures, doesn't it? It involves passing over exact processes to do stuff, but it also involves gathering up that intangible information as well. I don't know whether that's the right word, but it's information that isn't hard data, because if you're passing over stories and stuff, what would you say to people who kind of say, well, that's just all a bit fluffy, I just want the hard data?
I'd agree with you. I think it's definitely a horses for courses situation. Yeah. However, I think I remember being on a plane coming back from Washington and sitting next to the chief executive of a telecoms company in South America, who was trying to enact change in the organisation. He was trying to get them to adopt a new strategy, and he was struggling. And he said it took him 3 years. And at the end of that period, it was only then he realised, when he overheard something being at the water cooler. Everybody talks. I mean, we create coffee shops and we create spaces, the right spaces for people to talk in. Well, that's where very often the sort of interactions that shape businesses take place.
Yeah.
As an example, he found that the story, the water cooler story, was, yes, it had been tried before. And, you know, we've tried this before, and in a way, he was just feeding the same stereotypical negativity every time he put out a communication, instead of actually tackling it. As he said, if he'd have tackled it in a totally different way, if he'd have acknowledged right up front, said, hey, you might think we've done this before, but here's why it's different, yeah, it would have made such a difference to him. And he said it literally took him a few years to overcome that.
So he realised that the water cooler story was an objection. And
exactly,
he could have overcome that objection very easily had he known that beforehand. And that's how he finally did it. Thanks for that. Sorry for butting in. I just wanted to clarify
No, that's
that.
fine. It's often worth to clarify. Okay. And, you know, and one of the things that leads on to really is, how do you change the culture of an organisation? When you're doing, when you go into a business like this, I'll share with you one of the anecdotes. I think I've mentioned this to you before, that one of the things I did in my spare time about 5-6 years ago was to try and turn around the golf club I was voted as chairman of.
Yep.
And then we had we had what I would call 550 stakeholders, the members, and we had at least 16 staff in varying ability, varying levels of interest. And the issue for me was, this was a service business, you know, and it's not just a place that people turn up. You have, when you're taking a business that, say, £750,000 and you turn over and it's not necessarily, it hasn't got a marketing presence, it certainly didn't have a website. all the sort of things that you associate with being in business today. It had no social media activity. One of the things for me was to go back to basics, to know that I had to have the right foundations, which meant interviewing every member of staff when we started and saying to them, you know, you've been here X years. How do you think we can improve this organisation? You know, if you were doing what I'm doing, what would you do? What one thing or two things would you do to change the way that this organisation works, to make it better so that you enjoy it more? And it was surprising to me. It was a great lesson how many people actually volunteered ideas. The important thing then was, when those ideas have been put forward, is to be able to go back to people and respond and say, yes, okay, we haven't introduced that, here's why, or we have introduced that. Yep. The other thing was to publicly acknowledge that. And I always think back to days when I was in the dot-com era, working for a software business as an advisor. There, one of the important things was we were looking for innovation. So one of the challenges for us was how could we get innovation from within the organisation. And we had lots of different techniques and ideas for doing that. But the biggest thing at the time, again, was to publicly acknowledge the way people had put forward the ideas, and to go back in a sensible way and respond, all based on the stage gate process for new product development. Yep. But nevertheless, early sort of pre-gate one, it was, let's have a mechanism, a rigorous mechanism, and be seen to operate it for the generation of ideas. So going back to the golf club, the situation with them was quite simple. We had to bring everybody behind something, and at the time we brought them behind the idea of sort of a marketing push through a website. So we wanted to create a website. We were 115 years old. We had a huge amount of history. Henry Longhurst had been our president. The important thing was to bring it to life through the stories of the organisation that people who were there believed in. So the members believed in it, the staff believed in it. So a lot of the content was generated from sessions with the members. Yeah. And we had guys of 84, 85 buying computers so that they could actually participate in the development of the website, not from a technological point of view, but just so they could track it. Yeah. There's one anecdote I will share with you, which to me was sort of encapsulated the power of the story to bring forward the service culture of a business. We had a ridiculous situation. We appointed a new caterer, and there was a communication failure between the office. This is about 3 months into my tenure, 3-year tenure, and the communication problem had been such that we'd arranged for a bit of a flagship event where all the other captains in Sussex had turned up to play, and these are great influencers and they're great recommenders. Anyway, they all turned up, and golf clubs have this thing about giving people bacon rolls and coffee before they go. The coffee was there, but because the caterer hadn't turned up at the right hour, the bacon rolls weren't. Now, fortunately, we had a greenkeeper, still do, who was Brazilian, who spoke fluent Portuguese, and was able to talk to the caterer, who was Portuguese, and say, okay, we can solve this. And for those people who'd gone off foodless, they managed to ferry out all the food and extra coffee on the little machine called a gator and deliver it to each of the teas. And it was an astonishing thing. So it became, we had a picture drawn up of it, and it became sort of like the symbol of, okay, it's okay, occasionally you're going to screw up, but it's the way that you acknowledge that and go back to people that change the way that people perceive you. And the big point for me here, Kenny, is about advocacy and compliance. You're looking for people to be advocates for your brand. Yeah. Very often, out of failure, they can take forward that sense of advocacy because you've acknowledged it. I'll give you one more example, if I may. Yeah. I'm mentoring a local business in Sussex, and they're all young, which is great, and they're very lucky. They've been funded by their parents, but their parents are very hard-nosed business people. And one of the things that's emerged is there's a sense of resentment, which is, I suppose, slightly understandable in the times we're in. Anyway, on one of the local chat lines, there was a particularly unpleasant, one might call it vipurial, comment that was made about little rich girls plaything.
Oh, right, on a forum, was it?
On a forum.
Yep.
And you know, it not only is that damaging, but in the hospitality business, it's hugely demotivating. It can have an impact on, obviously, because what people write is often what other people's opinions are. I mean, that's what the world we live in. So what was interesting was we talked it through as a business, and the advice I gave them, which they followed, was to ride with the punch, effectively, to acknowledge it, to say, yes, we are incredibly lucky. But you know what? We're working our butts off, effectively. Yeah. We are trying to go the extra mile here to provide something that is really a quality service. Yeah, we do screw up occasionally. If if for whatever reason it didn't work for you, come back, have a coffee, talk about it. We'd be delighted to have you back with us.
Yeah.
And the difference that created, other people then on the forum instantly responded in defence of them.
Yeah, yeah. So they had their own little tribe there backing them up because they'd been open and transparent about stuff.
Totally.
Yeah, and it's about kind of turning some negativity into opportunities, which is the same as what you did with the bacon butties at the golf club, because you actually turned it into a novelty, and then it actually became a story for the club as well.
And I do think, Kenny, that is one of the biggest things that you can do in a situation like this. You know, I read on one of the LinkedIn forum the other day, there was a talking about engagement in communications. And it was particularly revealing because it played on a story. It played on something I was aware of and was involved in. It was to do. I think this was to do with the call centre, and the call centre at the time had achieved a 93% satisfaction rate, whatever that means.
Yeah.
And what was really interesting about that was the staff were berated for not getting 100%.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you know,
very common, isn't it? Very common.
It's very common.
Yeah.
And it's because there is no strategic helicopter view, is there? Very often that's the problem. We're driven by numbers and we're driven by statistics, and instead of looking back in the actuality, taking a sort of a step back and saying, you know, what have we actually achieved? We get into a spiral of improving incremental performance improvement, which actually is not necessarily positive.
That's correct. That's correct. Well, we've covered a lot here today, and I'd like to thank you. You obviously, you help big corporations, but from the sounds of it, you help smaller businesses as well, and even stuff like golf clubs as well. So it's really interesting stuff. Could I ask you?
There's one thing I would like to make a point, because I know it's something that you in your business you've thought about before. It's about mergers and how do you manage them.
That was something I was about to say. I was about to ask you whether we could come back and do another piece purely on acquisitions and mergers, because I think that's a good conversation within itself.
Okay, that's fine. Delighted to.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And is that okay? You'll come back and do that?
By all means, yeah. Be delighted to.
Brilliant. That's fantastic. Thanks a lot, Paul.
You're welcome. So
that was Paul Corney from Knowledge et al. And if you want to see more from Paul, you can go to his website at knowledgeetal.com. And this is Kenny Goodman from findtheedge.com. I'll speak to you again soon.